This is the third video in the series on Introduction to React JavaScript Development. This is a part of an overall series that's going to cover React, Node Express, and MongoDB. Here's the architecture diagram that shows the React at the top. That's what we're going to talk about in this final video. In particular, we're going to talk about the Newswatcher application and how that's put together. So if we take a look at the GitHub repository, just a reminder, this is where all the code is. This is the Newswatcher application, and what we'll do in this tutorial is we'll show the UI, different parts of it, and then we'll talk about how it's implemented in code. So just a quick review, you can log in. You can go to your profile and you can set up special news filters. The home page is basically all the news, well, a selection of the news, the top news. Profile lets you filter through that list and find specific stories just by keywords. So I have technology and earth. So here's my technology one with all these different companies. Then if I go to my news, it's filtered just by news on that. You can click and share a story, and then if you go to the shared news, you can add a comment. So let's take a quick look at the code, the project that's on GitHub. This is Visual Studio Code, and it has an overall structure to it. So you can see this is the node part of it. This is a server that's a node server. This is the package.json. And then these are various directories that implement the code. So here's there's a Lambda that's hosted on AWS. This is more of the node code. This in particular, the source directory, this is what we're going to look at. This contains the files for the React application. So this is where we'll start going over. So we'll show you some of the basics of how it gets started, and then we'll go to the UI, and then we'll show how it's implemented. The first file to look at in our React app, and we won't look at any UI for this one because it's like a foundational file. So for a React JavaScript application, we created it with the create React app command, if you remember in the first video. And it created for us this index.js. I made a few modifications since then, and then you'll see what it is. Now, if you actually look at it on GitHub, there's a little bit more complexity in the file with server-side rendering. I've taken that out for our purposes right here. The main purpose of this file is to get the rendering started, and it's code that was put in initially by the Create React app, and that is this particular line and some of these lines below. So if we look at what's imported, we've got React, React DOM, and as I said, the React DOM create root is what really kicks the whole process off and renders your application and is able to look at the HTML file, find that root element div, and then start replacing that with all of your JavaScript and all your HTML. Now, really what we're doing in this file is surfacing this app.js. So this is our functional component that's in this file, and that's what we'll cover next. Now, in order to do that, we are actually wrapping it with some other components. So the app is going to actually render some actual HTML. So that's a functional component that'll do that. Now these hash router, provider, and strict mode, those don't actually render any UI. They're just there to provide functionality as a wrapper for all the children that's underneath them. Strict mode is a component provided by React. It's advised by them to wrap your app with it. And what it does is it looks at any of the code that's running underneath, and it looks for things that are deprecated in the React SDK. To see those messages and errors, you would have to go to the developer tools, hit F12 on my Mac, Chrome, and then I can see those. This wrapper provides the Redux central store, state store, for the whole application. So it has to be at the highest level so that anything underneath it can then share that store across the whole hierarchy of components. So any component could read the state, it could set the state, This one here is the hash router that is part of React Router DOM. That gives us the navigation capability. So the hashtag routing or browser routing that you can put in to say in the URL with what paths you want to go to, and also surface the UI for the routing. So that's index.js. Now we can move on to the app.js, a very important file, which is really the start of where you put your code in for your UI. And so for us, we're going to put into app.js basically the routing capability, the navigation capability. So what you see up here is the navigation. And let's go take a look then at the file. We'll start from the top. One of the first things we'll take a look at are the imports. So these all come from a directory relative to the root of where our app.js is. So there's a directory called views, and if we look at that, we can see views, and this is where all the pages that we want to render separately, distinctly created and available to import. So we have a view for the login, one for the main news, one for the personal news, shared news, our profile, and then the not found. Now these other imports, so we have Redux that we're using, right? So that's the state management. We'll talk about these two. So these are components that we wrote. This is, coming from Redux, and these are not components, these are functions. So you can import things like components or functions. So we'll describe those functions in a moment. And then this is for the navigation. So we use a combination of Bootstrap and React Router DOM to do the navigation. And this is the CSS and then just the React import. So here's our functional component then, the app function that was imported and used here in the index.js. First thing at the top is a useEffect call. So this is one of those React hooks, and we demonstrated earlier the use of this function useEffect, and inside of that we stated that most of the time or a lot of the time what you want to do is place some kind of HTTP call either to your service or a third-party service. We're not doing that here. What we're doing is we're looking at local storage. So window is an object that's always available. We don't have to import it. You can always just add access to it just because it's a JavaScript application. So React is basically a browser application. So you're able to access anything that a browser JavaScript SDK gives you access to. So there happens to be a window object. Off of that, there's local storage, and then you can call get item. So what we're doing is we're looking to see if we stored something in there, which happens to be the token. So when you log in, you can actually select keep me logged in. And then when we log in, code somewhere else puts the token into local storage. Now, if we close that and then go to Newswatcher again, we're still logged in. Okay, so we can go and navigate until we log out, and then it would remove that token. So what we do is when we store something, we store it as text, so we need to turn that back into an object. And that's what this JSON.parse is doing. So we get the token. If it is there, if it isn't, then we don't have anything to do. This, of course, if you remember, states only run this once when this page is refreshed or rendered. So the dispatch call. So this is used, and it comes from React Redux. So this is a special module or package that we can get at. And dispatch is how you set something into storage. So we're setting something in there and in a location and a type called receive token success, and then we set a message and we set the session token. So these are the things that we're sending and get routed into Redux. Now, if you recall from the UI, this is a special area where whenever it reads messages from the state, Redux state. And so when we set something in there, then it will show up here. And so we're saying, signed in as Eric or whatever as you sign in. Okay, here's the next thing to look at, which is a logout function. So this is when we click on logout in the upper right. If we click on this, that code gets run. In the code, you can do it whatever you want it to do, but in our case, we're making a call back to the Node HTTP API, and we pass in a method called delete. So on the session, we say delete the session. So we could, for example, invalidate that session token so that, we could set something in the database that would say, if they try to log in again, they don't have a live session token, and they have to create another one. Here's a dispatch that says, put the message up, signed out. So we clear local storage. Now, window.location.hash, anywhere in your code you can put this, and you can navigate through code. And we're navigating basically back to the home page. Now, as we talked about before, functional components, they can have a return statement. Most likely will always have a return statement. And that returns the UI that you want to show. So this could be HTML, right? A div is an HTML element, a tag. Or it can be a component which in turn renders some kind of HTML. So ultimately, underneath the nav bar or anything that's in here is going to show up as some kind of underlying HTML element. We don't need to know what it is. This is a higher level concept. So nav bar is going to show us the navigation bar. So this is what this is. Now you notice if we collapse it down like it would show up on a mobile device, it turns into this little hamburger, and we can open and close it. So it does that automatically for us. We don't need to write any code to do that. This is navbar.brand. So you can put some kind of logo or text, and that's what we've got over here. Newswatcher text right there. Here are the different selections or links, anchors that you can click on. So we have different ones. So here's homepage news, my news. These represent all the views that you want to navigate back and forth to. Now these ones are not showing up. So this is shorthand. We look at the Boolean logged in, and we got that basically back up here. The use selector allows us to get values out of the Redux store. So we can see if we're logged in, if there's a session token, and what the current message is. And this acts in real time. So anytime the state changes, for example, with the current message, we don't have to call this function again. It's just sitting here in this local variable, and then this gets shown here as the current message. Same thing with logged in. So if we're logged in, then this is like an if statement, right? It's just shorthand JavaScript. Logged in, and so if this is false, then this part of the code doesn't execute. If it is, then this executes, and then it shows. So this is an easy way to hide or show different UI elements in that log in the menu. Now, if you remember, we talked about the route. So this actually is the capability with React Router DOM for doing the routing. So we're using the hash routing. So we can go to different paths off of our main path, which is the home news view. So each of these will display a different UI or render a different part of our UI based on this element. So this element basically says, for this one, if you go to this path, then show us the login view. So you could type these in directly, or you can click up here, for example, to go to the shared news. You can either type /shared news, or you can click on shared news, and then that routes you. So that's the app.js file. The next file we'll look at is the login.js file. That's the functional component that puts up the login page. So we can come here to the login link, and that navigates us to /login. If you're not signed up, you could click this, and that would display the register, and you could give yourself a name, display name to be known by in the comments, email address, and password, and then click register. What we don't do in Newswatcher, but I would recommend it that you do, is you actually send an email then to this address. So before the account gets activated, they need to verify that they actually have access to that email. All right. Otherwise, they enter the email address, password. They could click keep logged in, and then they click the login button, and then it navigates them to the My News. This is the view that basically shows them the filtered news that they set up through the profile. So here's the code for that login page that we've been showing. Let's first look at the imports up at the top. So here's our hook for the use state. Here's an interesting one. So we talked about in code, you could actually navigate. We've seen how to do that with the window object, but here we're going to do something different. We're going to navigate to a different path, but we're going to use React Router DOM. So we can use the use navigate, and then here's the same Redux that we've seen to get the value from Redux and set the value. Here's some different UI elements that we can use from Bootstrap. So a button, a modal dialog, and a form checkbox. And then here's a form. This is for putting up image icons in our UI. So if we go back and look at see this eyeball and this person here. Also on the sign up, we've got those as well. And here's a little image icon and another one here. Where those come from is actually this npm package. You can install it. If we go back and look at the package.json, these things need to be installed. And once they're installed, then you can use that in your code. Let's go back here. Here's the website where you can look up any of these images. So if I type in I, there's the one we use for I. This is just for general usage. If we actually click on React, we can see you can use it like this inside of React. Okay, these, so here's the ones that we're using, right? The I, the user, the power button, and the close. The fill group is actually something that we've created, I've created. And it's just so I can have some shorthand for using the form group. So if we go back to the UI one more time. So this is a form group. This is a label with an image icon and then some kind of a text entry or text display. So that kind of comes as a unit. So we wanted to create something in one single component, functional component that we could pull in. So it has an ID, an icon, a label, properties, for example. So when we use one, we can search for that. Here we are. We're saying it's of type text. Here's the icon we want to pass in. Here's the label. Here's a placeholder before we put something in, and then a handler. So it's kind of a little handy shortcut for us. So here's our functional component then for this login page. And we'll see that it's a mix of JavaScript to create this React page, and it's got HTML elements that we'll come across. So the first thing we do is we get the session out of this Redux state, so we can know if we're logged in or not. This is, again, for setting something in the Redux state. Then we've got a bunch of hooks for the use state. So when somebody types in their name or email or password or use the checkout checkbox, or if they click to open up the modal dialog, then we want to keep track of those. So these are the functions that they can call basically to set that. Now here's some functions then that are the handlers for things that if they click on. So the things they can click on would be login or sign up. So we want handlers for those. So if they actually click to register, if we go back to the UI, sign up and register, so that's the handler for this button. And what we do is we create their account. So there is a React call using fetch. That's the browser capable SDK functionality that's exposed. And we do a post to the user endpoint API. That means we want to create a user. And Here's the JSON. So the JSON contains a display name, an email for that person, and a password. A response comes back, and hopefully it's a good response. There could be a registration failure. For example, if you tried to create a person twice, you would get a failure, and the error message would be displayed to say, user already exists. The next function, really the only other function here is logging in. It's very similar to the register, so we can kind of go over this a little bit quicker. So this time we do a post to a session. In other words, to create a new session token. Post would do that. Put is more like an update, and then delete or get would be some of the other verbs. Here's the email and password, and it could be successful or not. So if there's an error, it gets thrown and it gets down here. We don't sign them in, and we say perhaps, incorrect password. Otherwise, we sign them in if it's successful, and if they've checked the checkbox, remember me is true, and we can set that in local storage. Otherwise, we remove any token from local storage. So these are the other handlers, and these are the handlers for the text changing. So as they enter new text in the email or the password, that's where that goes. Or for the register dialog, we also have handlers for those. So if somebody clicks the button, for example, to open up the register, then show modal, that we set that to true, and then that's going to trigger the modal dialog to be shown. So this is the code for the modal dialog, and it's kind of interesting. It's not like you call this at any point and then it all of a sudden pops up. It's basically always there, it's just not being shown. So you can see we have this modal, which we get from Bootstrap, modal dialog, and it has a flag on it, show. Now if that's true, then it's going to be shown. If it's false, it's not going to be shown. Now let's see where this is actually used. So remember we talked about having every functional component needs a return. So if we're already logged in, we just return saying we're logged in. And actually this won't happen unless you actually go to the login, type it in by hand. We could actually, probably would be better if we redirect them to some other page. But anyway, if they're not logged in, right, then the login UI gets rendered. In other words, that's what this is, right? We see the email address and the password to type in. So here is the email address, here's the password, here's the checkbox and the button. Now notice this. So this is how we pull it in, right? It's in curly braces, so it's basically calling this function is what we're doing. And then that function, then we could have just copied all of that HTML and the components that we have right in line right here. But just to kind of pull it out so it's on its own, we put it right here. So it basically does a return. It puts all of this in the DOM, and it's just not shown until this flag gets set to true. So let's look at this. So it's pretty similar to the login, right? So there's a form group on this form. There's a submit, which is basically the handle register. So they can type in the display name, the email, and the password, and then they can click to register. Down here is if they click to close the modal. So if we go back here, right, so they could sign up. If they cancel, that's where this is, right? So see the cancel right here? Otherwise, when they do the submit, here's the handle register. They could also hit the X, and that would also close it. So if we go here, we already looked at this, but one of the things it does is set the modal to false. So when they hit the register, that'll go away. So that's basically the login view. Here is the profile view UI. You can see the title at the top, and it basically contains a form, and this form consists of this drop down and text entry controls. These are, of course, those field groups. And then you've got some buttons along the bottom. So you can add a new filter. So the current one, there's only one filter. You can delete a filter, or you can add a filter. So we can add a filter, give it a name. Let's say we want sports, and we can add our keywords in. And there's a bunch of keywords. We can save that. And if you remember here, we put the message up through Redux. We set that to the central state, and that shows up here in app.js, if you remember seeing that. And the only other thing on the profile page is you can delete your account. Now, you can't click this button until they have checked, and then it gets enabled. So you can see there's some interesting React enabling that. So we'll cancel that. Okay, now we'll go look at the code for how this all gets put in place. Here's the file, profileview.js. So we'll just walk through it top to bottom. We have the import statements, as we've seen before. May not be anything new here. We've got the useState, useEffect hooks. UseEffect is something that runs when the page is first updated or refreshed, or if it happens to have some variable it's watching for a change, and then the state for the local state variables. Navigation, we won't cover this right now. And then here's for the form. We have a form we're going to create, and the form group that we talked about, checkbox, buttons, modal dialog that exists here to unregister or delete your account. Then the font awesome we saw already. And then here's the icons for font awesome we have on some of the buttons. There's the field group. Okay, so here's our functional component. We called it profile view. Here are our local state variables. Here's the properties passed in. While we're right here, let's just quickly look at a refresher here. In the app.js, it actually includes the profile view here. You can see that we are getting from the local state storage, from the Redux storage session, and we're going to pass that in as a property into the profile. So here's profile being used, and we pass it in as a property. We use the use selector. Now, again, this is debatable where you want to put your code and where you want to get things. We could have done that down here in the profile view. We could have, instead of passing in the property, we could have also used the use selector and got that. Anyway, that's the way that I'm doing it here. So here's the different states that we're setting locally. Here's the property for things being passed in from our parent, which is the app.js. And then here is a useEffect. And so in this case, when we go to the profile view, we want to pull the user profile information and then display that, which is going to be the filters in this case, right? It's not the username and password, but it is the filter settings that we want to take a look at. So we do a fetch, and the method is a get. Now here's the session token. So we also are having that passed in, because we'll talk about this in the node video, but you just don't want to have it wide open on the API. It needs to be authorized, so there's a token at login time that we get that gets passed in. Now, the user ID is also a part of that session, so that way I can't access somebody else's information. If you actually knew somebody else's ID, you still couldn't get it because it has to match up with what's in the token, and you can't alter that. Here's the response that comes back, and error handling, and basically we get the filter and then we set that up and save that locally. So here's the user, and that's where that's going to be. And then we have some other, the selection index is, depending on which filter you select and things like that, showing the modal. And the delete OK is, if you remember, you can't delete your account unless that checkbox is checked. So that is the useEffect. There are just a few handlers. So if you unregister, it deletes the user account. So it will no longer exist. So if you tried to log in, you couldn't log in anymore. And it also, just out of interest, it dispatches the message to say account deleted. And we actually have this callback that goes back to the app. Since we have a logout capability there, we basically log ourselves out because that got passed into us, and we want to do the full logout, and then we won't be in the app anymore. Now we can change the name. So here's some handlers, right? We can change the filter name. We can add, keywords and things like that. So those are those handlers right there. And then we can add a new one. So that's what's going on there. And we can delete, and we can save. So the save actually writes it back to the backend API and the database. So that is what's going on there. And finally, we make it down here to the actual return for the rendering, so the return of the HTML. When we first come to this page, right, there's this race condition. So we have the use effect, which is going back to the backend to get the user, but at the same time, we have the code here that is going to try and render something, but we don't have the user yet because it wasn't set. So we have to put up something. So if you look really carefully, we can see if we can actually see it here. We'll go to shared news. Oh, did you see it right there on the screen? Yeah. Loading profile. So it went up just for a second, a split second. And then this is all asynchronous, right? This is the great thing about React and about these spas. They have asynchronous capabilities, so nothing is blocking. Okay, continuing down here. So here's the big return that we have once we have the user with all of that HTML. So it's a div that's wrapping everything. Here's that header. And then the form groups that we've got the field groups, and so we've got the different controls that we saw, the select control. We have our news filters, and we want to enter, so that's an array, a JavaScript array that contains the names of all the filters. So we want to loop through that, and so we can use the map capability in JavaScript. That's an array, a function on an array, and you get in that array, there's each element, we just name it filter, you can name it whatever you want. But in each element, that's an object. And so we get the name, and we just give it an index. So that is looping through and then creating that drop-down select control. And then here's the other controls, fill group for getting the name of the filter and the keywords of the filter. And finally, we have the three buttons along the bottom. Now, if you remember from the login, we took the approach where we didn't want all the code or all the HTML, all the markup together, so we split some of it out. And I had mentioned at the time, we could have just put it all in line. And that's what I'm doing here. So this modal is all in line right here, so it all gets returned, but it's not actually shown because it has, again, that Boolean. So this show modal is, if we search for that, right, so it's a local variable, and then if they click one of the buttons, then on a click right here, right, no longer have a need, here's the button. If they click that, it goes to the handle open modal, which then sets the flag to true, and then this gets shown. And then this is simple, right? We have the checkbox, and the button has a disabled property on it here, and we can basically just key off of this delete OK. So here's a form check, and if you check it on and off, then it toggles this delete OK, which then shows or hides this button. All right, so that's basically what we've got for the profile view, the code, and how it works. The last code we get to look at here for the Newswatcher application has to do with showing the news. And we'll kind of look at all three of the files at the same time that render this UI. So for the JavaScript and markup mix that we're going to look at, it's very similar. So we'll be able to see some of the overlap. So there's three lists of news, right? The homepage news, my news, the shared news. The one difference here is with my news, you get to pick a filter, you get to pick one of your filters, so there's a drop down. Otherwise, for the shared news, right, it pulls it from one location, my news, and another one. So there are 3 different feeds that they're getting from the back end. And then the added twist here with the shared news and my news is that you can share something and you can comment on something. So that's what the UI looks like. So let's take a look and dive into the code. So here's the 3 files for each of the 3 views. The home news, which you don't have to be logged in to see. The news view, you need to be logged in for that, or the shared news. This is for the filtered news view. So let's look at the first one. So for the home news view, we have this use effect that when this view gets shown, gets activated. So this call does a fetch. So we go to home news as the API, we do a get. And in this case, we're going to call dispatch. We're going to put it in the Redux store. So we get the response that comes back from the HTTP request, and we put that into news. So the JSON goes there. And then basically it's pretty simple from here on out. We have the is loading from the Redux state that we look at. Otherwise, if something came in, we actually have is loading is false, and then the news is set here. We can use the map function again, as we saw before, and we can loop over the elements of each news story. And here is where we're using the list tag. So this is just straight, simple HTML. However, the card is something we get from Bootstrap. It ends up, of course, ultimately going to some HTML markup. So cards are something you can use to display. They have a card title and a body. So here we're setting the image that we get from the news story. We're setting the title, the content snippet, and the news source. And so that gets put in there. There's also one card that's not part of this map. It's above all the other cards. In order to use the New York Times API, you're required to give them attribution. So we place a card right at the beginning that says, this data is provided by the New York Times. So that's that code. And then if we look at the shared news, that's also going to the back end. And so we have an API for the shared news, and that is pretty similar. We do the fetch to get that. There's another fetch for when we add a comment, so we do a post on that. And then here's similar code. We have to give the attribution at the top from the New York Times, and then we have a map that goes over the news stories. Now, the one difference between the home news and the shared news is that we put the shared news where we're using a local hook, a useState hook. And so that goes into here, into the news, instead of going to the Redux. Okay, so not much else new there, just the same map that we saw and the cards we're creating. We have to display the comments on the cards, so that's being done. And then the last one we'll look at is the filtered news. So here's the call at the very beginning. We go to the users and we actually get the filter. And inside that filter then are the news stories, so the stories that were filtered. So we get those and we set that up into the local state. So now we have whether or not it's loading or not, and the news filters. And here's also another fetch call. So we have to do a post if somebody shares a story. So that's what that is. And then we have the loading state. Until we're loaded, we show loading news. And then when it's up, we have to show the attribution at the top again. And then here is a form group with the select. So we have a map that goes over all the filters, and we can show the selections in the drop down. And here's another list control for HTML, and we create the cards underneath that. Pretty similar to what we saw before. So that's the end of the third of the series of videos on React JavaScript. full stack development, I encourage you to go look at the rest of the videos that I have on the other parts of the three-tier architecture. So there's the service tier with Node and Express, and then there's the database with MongoDB.